The following interview was originally published in Blab number 4 in the summer of 1989. All questions will be prefaced by the word Blab, and Clowes' answers will be prefaced with me saying Clowes. Let's begin. Blab. Your first trade paperback should be out by the time this interview appears. What's the book about? Clowes. It's a collection of what I feel are all the best stories from my comic, Lloyd Llewellyn. It's a compilation, sort of a best-of type book. I tried to weed out a lot of the earlier stuff, the stuff that really makes me cringe when I look at it. Blab. What's the main purpose behind doing such a book? Clowes. I want to reach a different audience other than the comic shop crowd. You see a lot of this stuff turning up in record stores and regular bookstores, and I figure if I put together a really nice package, I might get some attention. There are also a lot of people who haven't been able to find all the Lloyd Llewellyns, especially the last few. The early ones had such high print runs that they're easier to find. The last two, I still get letters from people who say they can't find them, so I hope the book will solve this problem. Blab. You've also got a new comic that should be hitting the stands right around the same time. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it? Clowes. The name of the book is Eightball. The closest thing to it coming out these days, format-wise, that I can think of is Crumb's Hup, in that each issue will feature 3 or 4 self-contained stories with a pretty broad range of subject matter. The first issue features a Lloyd Llewellyn story, an indictment of the comics industry, a sadomasochistic nightmare, and also a parody of those little religious tracts put out by Jack T. Chick. And at only $2, it's a real steal. Blab. You're relatively new to the comic book biz. How long have you been active professionally? Clowes. Since late 1985, when I finished Lloyd Llewellyn number 1. Blab. What would you say is the difference between the type of comics you do and those published by, say, Marvel Comics? Clowes. I'd like to think that there's every difference. I'm pursuing what I think is a personal vision unencumbered by financial concerns, which is the diametrical opposite of what Marvel Comics is trying to do. Everything in Marvel Comics is compromised. Absolutely every line in their books is compromised. It's not anybody's personal vision. I'm not necessarily saying that my work is so wonderful, but at least it's the vision of a singular artist, someone who is trying to express a singular view. The thing about Marvel Comics is that they're so boring. It doesn't matter how stupid or bad they are. I'd gladly read something that is exceptionally stupid or bad, as long as it was done by someone with some sort of a personal vision, even if that person was a complete moron. At least their work would be interesting. You see some of these small press people doing some of their own superheroes, and those are kind of funny because they're so crazy. Like the Christian guy in Virginia who does those weird Christian superheroes. Those are great because the guy just accepts the conventions of superhero-dom and then takes it to his own crazy extreme. But Marvel Comics are just by bored people who churn out as many pages to make as much money as they can. They couldn't care less, and I don't care what they say in their defense, because if they really cared about anything other than making a buck, they wouldn't be working on stuff like that unless they were total fools. Blab. Do you have any idea what sort of audience reads your book? Clowes. I'm completely shocked by the kind of people who read my stuff. I would have thought it would have been a very specific crowd, maybe college-age males. But I've found that a lot of my readers are women, and a lot of them are old hippie types who think stuff is funny that I didn't necessarily intend to be funny. It's a real diverse crowd, bound together by their excellent taste in comics. Blab. Do you feel a sense of embarrassment when you're at a party and someone asks you what you do for a living? Clowes. Oh no, not at all. I thrive on the fact that it's such a sleazy profession. Blab. But doesn't it bother you that the person may think you draw something like the X-Men? Clowes. Yeah, that would bother me. But I usually say to them, I do adult comics. And they always think I'm some kind of pervert. And then I say, no, I don't mean to say I'm involved in rendering full penetration shots for the raincoat crowd. It's just that they're not tailored to the standard 13-year-old audience. Blab. Okay, let's back up a bit. Where were you born and raised? Clowes. Here on the south side of Chicago. Then, when I was 18, I moved to New York for a while. Blab. At about what age did you first take an interest in art? Clowes. In art? I don't know whether I ever took an interest in art. Well, my brother was a voracious reader who left his comics laying around all the time. And I remember looking at like a Superboy or Jimmy Olsen comic book cover for hours and thinking, how did this guy draw those lines? And having no idea how someone could draw perfect smooth lines like that. And I remember wanting to be able to do that very badly. This is before I was able to read, so I must have been 3 or 4. Blab. Were either of your parents artists? Is there any sort of artistic streak that runs through your family? Clowes. No, not really. My dad is a woodworker, so he's somewhat of a designer, but there are really no artistically inclined people in my family. My mom is an auto mechanic, owns her own shop. Blab. So comics were responsible for getting you first interested in art. Clowes. Yeah, I was surrounded by them when I was real young, and I always bought comics even when I didn't like them because the format appealed to me so much. They're just little pamphlets with pictures in them, but I love them. Blab. Were your parents encouraging and supportive towards your interest in art? Clowes. They weren't real supportive, but they weren't unsupportive either. They certainly didn't discourage it or discourage me from reading comics because I read quote unquote real books too. I was a kid during the 60s, and as long as I wasn't dropping acid or bombing the ROTC, they weren't too worried about me reading comics. I can remember showing drawings to relatives, and they'd say, "Oh, that's great. You are really talented." And I'm not sure whether they were bullshitting me or not, but I believed it. And I think that had a lot to do with it. That kept me going for a long time. Blab. Aside from the reinforcement by your relatives, were comics the main source that you derive continual inspiration from to motivate you with your art? Clowes. Well, yeah. But when I was about 6, Mad Magazine became the main source. I wanted to work for Mad. That was my goal at age 6. I had no goal other than that. I was 6 years old in 1968, so it was definitely after the heyday of Mad as we now know it. But at the time, this was such a gigantic thing to me. I was really, really obsessed with it. And this was before I could really read, so it had nothing to do with what they were parodying. It was just the look of it. I remember my grandmother looking at the cover of one issue and saying, "Why do you want to read this? Look at this boy. He's an idiot." Blab. Who was your top favorite artist in Mad Magazine? Clowes. Mort Drucker. I remember thinking that he was the best, that he was the real genius behind Mad. The covers, the Norman Mingo covers used to really get to me. I can remember those first covers I saw much better than any of the kids I went to school with. Blab. Do you recall the first comic book that had a big impact on you? Clowes. I remember reading my brother's Jimmy Olsen's obsessively. I never liked Superman all that much. Whenever I'd read a Superman story, I'd skim ahead to the parts where he was Clark Kent because that was a lot more interesting to me than when he was beating up people or just flying around. I could hardly relate to that at all. Whereas Jimmy Olsen was doing these human things. Even though they were the stupidest things in the world, they were very interesting to me as a kid. They had a real effect on me. Also, I remember this cover to, I think, A Strange Adventures that shows this typical family with a huge blazing sun in the background. I think it was drawn by Murphy Anderson. I'm not sure. And the family is sweating, but for some reason, all the water is frozen, and the kids are trying to drink this frozen water out of a fountain. I can remember seeing that cover and then starting to cry and bashing my head against the wall because I was so unnerved by the situation. I thought, how can this be? It's so hot, and yet the water is frozen. Bam, bam. And then my mom came running in and looked at me. What the fuck is wrong with you? And I showed her, look at this. These people are suffering. It's awful. These images had real power over me. Blab. What sort of reaction did you have when you first discovered the work from the early color comic book issues of Mad by Harvey Kurtzman? Clowes. The first strips that I saw from those early issues were Super Duper Man and Batboy and Reuben by Wally Wood. Super Duper Man just floored me. I thought of that and Batboy and Reuben as being the best Mad work I had ever seen at the time. When I saw those 2 early Mad strips by Kurtzman and Wood, I realized that, yeah, that's what I want to do. Blab. Outside of Mad, who else has had an influence on you? Clowes. 2 people I can think of offhand are Tom Lehrer and Charles Addams. Lehrer was a Harvard professor who made the rounds in the late 50s and 60s as a satirical songwriter and singer, and for some reason my family had all of his albums. He was very funny. He had a self-deprecating, highbrow, lowbrow quality that always cracked me up. My grandfather was a history professor at the University of Chicago at the time, and Tom Lehrer always reminded me of a funny version of most of his colleagues. As far as Adams, in many ways, he's my idol. A great, great cartoonist in every way, and a strong role model. His work from the last 20 years is kind of spotty, but his cartoons from the 40s through the early 60s are probably my favorite cartoons of all time. They were funny and creepy, oddly moving, and disturbing. It's really a shame that he croaked before I had a chance to meet him. Blab. You've got quite a collection of books, magazines, and records piled around this room. Are there specific themes in what you read or what you like to listen to? Clowes. It changes all the time. I go through phases. That's why I have so much junk. Having a lot of records is very important because I have to be listening to exactly the right record when I'm working. Lately, I've been listening to a lot of Les Baxter records, specifically The Sacred Idol. Also, Bo Diddley's 500% More Man, my Slim Harpo records, the Raunch Hands new LP, which I did the cover for, my Kingsman records. Who knows what it'll be next week? Reading is the same way. I just reread David Goodis's Nightfall and parts of Frederick Brown's Madball this past weekend, and also the new Weirdo. Blab. You've got some pretty sleazy movie posters tacked to your wall. Are there any movies or filmmakers that are particular favorites? Clowes. Yeah, I like Russ Meyer, Hitchcock, Jack Webb stuff, especially the DI, all of Stanley Kubrick's movies, especially The Killing and Lolita. Let's see, there's a million others. The Swimmer, Shriek of the Mutilated, While the City Sleeps, the films of Roman Polanski. Stop me before I really get going. Blab. Since we're on the subject of trash pop culture, let's talk a bit about those gruesome EC horror and crime comics. How did those affect you? Clowes. I didn't discover those until I was in high school, when that oversized hardcover Nostalgia Press reprint book came out. At first, I didn't realize that they were stories from actual comic books that you could once buy off the stands back in the 1950s. I just thought that they were stories that a bunch of perverts had drawn. I mean, the very first story I opened to in that book was the one about the baseball players, where they used human appendages for bats and bases. And I was just appalled by that. It was great. I just couldn't believe it. Blab. EC consistently cranked out the wildest graphics and craziest stories ever to appear in comics. That is, until Wortham wrote Seduction of the Innocent. After you read his book, what were your impressions of him? Clowes. I'd always thought of him as being kind of this Nazi fascist creep who really tried to curtail the comics industry for some sort of personal gain. But after reading his book, I came away thinking he was really just looking out for kids. I don't think he was such a bad fellow personally. He was an interesting guy, but a guy with no sense of humor, no real sense of the crassness of American culture, who must have been genuinely shocked by this stuff. Here's this guy from where? Germany, who grew up listening to Strauss waltzes, and he moves over here and comes across these comics with stories about baseball players being ripped apart and made into bass lines. I mean, it's too bad that the comics industry got shackled with a code as a result, but I can certainly see his point. I don't mean to say that I agree with any of his assertions. Clearly, he was the wrong man for the job. But I don't think he was evil or mean-spirited in any way. Just another misguided do-gooder. Blab. Since Wortham portrayed comic book readers as being potential juvenile delinquents well on the road to ruin, why don't you fill us in on what high school was like for you? Were you a social misfit? Clowes. Natch. Yeah, I'd say I was. I went to kind of a tough prep school for hyper-competitive yuppies. I never got along with anyone there except for the losers, outcasts, and misfits. Blab. Were you more of a loner? Clowes. I was definitely a loner. I worked my schedule out so I could be out by 11:30 every day. I'd go from 8 in the morning until 11:30, and then I'd come home and watch Gilligan's Island, take a nap, and then draw comics for the rest of the day. I was pretty much of a geek. Now, of course, I'm fabulously popular and have a stunningly beautiful girlfriend who's a ballet dancer, and who would be pissed if I didn't mention her in this interview. Blab. Upon graduation, did you then head off to college? Clowes. Yeah, I went to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York for the next 4 years. I've got my degree up on my wall, like a dentist's office. Blab. What were your aspirations upon graduating from Pratt? Clowes. After 4 years at Pratt, I'd kind of abandoned the idea of doing comics because they seemed like a dead end at the time. This was in the early 80s when there were a few things going on, but in general, it seemed like the whole industry was going to collapse. Weirdo had just come out, but it really appeared that Crumb was just dangling from a thread to do these last few issues before he burned out and died, and I felt like I was being really irresponsible to waste my money on college if I wasn't going to get some semi lucrative career out of it. At that point, I leaned more towards being an illustrator in the Seymour Trask, R.O. Bleckman vein. Something that was totally simple so I could hire assistants to imitate my world famous style while I made billions of dollars. This never did pan out, unfortunately. Blab. Why didn't you stay in New York and pursue a career in illustration? Clowes. It just got to me after a while. To be a kid just coming out of college and trying to be an illustrator in New York with no connections is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. It's a real nightmare. Almost all the magazines in New York won't even give you a personal interview. You have to drop your portfolio off, and you know they never even look at it. After a while, you feel like you're wasting your time, that you're on a treadmill. I realized I wasn't the world's greatest artist, but success in the commercial art game has more to do with knowing the right people and being a real ass kisser in the beginning. Blab. So you just got fed up with the whole scene and said, fuck New York? Clowes. Well, not exactly. As I was taking my portfolio around, I had a lot of spare time. I had nothing else to do, so I'd do comics. I'd think, oh, maybe I could sell one of these to the National Lampoon or something like that. The fact that I was so unfamiliar with the existing comics market really helped me, because if I had known how few people there were that would publish my work, I might not have even thought about it. I felt that somewhere there was a giant marketplace for comic strips that I wasn't tapping into, and that's when I began to develop Lloyd Llewellyn. Blab. Lloyd doesn't seem to be your typical comic strip character, in the sense that he's kind of low-key. Is there a special reason for this? Clowes. In creating the character, I wasn't really influenced by comics at all. I wanted to have a character who was somewhat of an everyman type. He was really poorly defined at first because I wanted him to be able to encompass any type of story that I decided to do. I wanted not necessarily an innocent in a corrupt world, but a straight man to a wacky world. Blab. How'd you come up with such a weird name for the character? Clowes. Actually, I had made up the name about a year before. I'd been rereading all those Jimmy Olsen comics, and they had this recurring theme about how Superman's life always related to double L's. For instance, Lois Lane and Lana Lang, they'd really get kind of extreme with it. There was this one story where he goes back to relive various stories out of Greek mythology, and they'd say, notice that Achilles has two L's, as does Golden Fleece, and they'd accent the L's with bold type. And I thought, that is so weird. And that's when I came up with the name. So when I came up with the character, I had this name laying around, so I decided to use it. Blab. How did you go about shopping the character around? First, I drew up the strip, very slowly and very tentatively. I wasn't really drawing comics too much at the time, and hadn't really learned to use a brush yet. So I was using pen points and experimenting, and I had to do something to jazz the strip up. So after I finished it, I had film positives made of it, and painted the reverse side of them with animation cell paint. It was a pretty striking effect for comics, because I had never seen anything that looked exactly like it. So I put it in a little binder and started looking for places to sell it. Eventually, I sent it to Fantagraphics Books, hoping they might use it as a backup feature or as part of an anthology, and I didn't hear from them for quite a while, so I forgot about it. Then I got a call from a guy who says, "This is Gary Groth." At the time, it didn't really occur to me that this was the Gary Groth who writes for the Comics Journal and who everybody thinks is the meanest guy in the world. Here's this real nice guy calling me up and saying, "Oh, we love your work. We'd like to give you a regular title." And I was just floored by this, just absolutely shocked. My first thought was, what an idiot. I really thought that these people were a bunch of morons to want to do an entire book of my stuff. But then I started to think, well, what the hell? Blab. Your strip premiered in Love and Rockets. What was the initial reader reaction to it? Clowes. Well, I think because it was in Love and Rockets, a lot of Love and Rockets fans got very offended that something should taint their magazine. And I can sort of understand that, especially such an early, raw effort. I'll be eternally grateful to the Hernandez brothers for allowing my strip to run in their magazine, because I'm not sure whether I'd ever allow someone else to run something in my magazine. Blab. How was the first issue received? Clowes. With confusion. People were expecting something, I'm not sure what, but it wasn't exactly what they were looking for. And they were very confused by it. They just didn't get it yet. Then around the third issue, I got a lot of letters saying, I finally get what you're trying to do. I think because I used a lot of thinly veiled sarcasm, people weren't sure whether they should take it seriously or whether I was trying to be funny. Blab. Exactly what were you trying to do? Clowes. To be honest, with the first few issues, I was just trying to learn how to do comics, because never before in my life had I done more than a 5-page strip. And when I did do a 5-page strip, I'd write it and draw the first 2 pages in one night and finish it drunkenly the next day. And here I was having to do something I was going to have to answer for. It was difficult. I really had to struggle a lot. It's hard to do comics. You have to do a lot of things well to do good comics. You have to be a draftsman and a stage director and all kinds of things. It's hard to hone all those skills at once. It's much easier to be just a penciler or an inker, but to start with a blank sheet of paper and end up with something semi-worthwhile is extremely difficult. Blab. Looking over some of the early Lloyd Llewellyns, I get the feeling that Bernie Krigstein's work from those EC horror and crime comics had somewhat of an influence on your style. Clowes. I wish they could have had more of an influence. There's only a limited number of his stories that I've seen, but that story, Pipe Dream, from that Nostalgia Press reprint book that I mentioned earlier, just blew me away when I saw it. I'd show it to some people and they'd say, oh, his art is so crude and so scratchy. But there's something about that story that just had an incredible effect on me because I could see that this was a real artist working here. This wasn't just some Joe Lunchpail trying to pay the rent. Blab. He brought a lot of emotion to his strips. Clowes. Yeah, you could just picture him with a goatee and sunglasses and a beret, living in a garret somewhere, drawing those strips at midnight with a Chianti bottle next to his easel. Blab. What other artists' work played a big influence in shaping your style? Clowes. Everybody. I can pick up something from anybody. At one point, I was a sponge who could pick up little nuances from just about anybody. I was always intrigued by a technique when I didn't know how it was done. Even terrible artists, I'll pick up stuff from. Sometimes bad artists will have an effective, primitive look to their stuff that's real direct, and I'll try to incorporate the spirit of it into my work. But now that I've assimilated most of this stuff, I'm more concerned with trying to put down on paper exactly what I see in my head. If I have to draw a face, I don't say to myself, I think I'll rip off a Reed Crandall face. I go look for a photo, or ideally a model that fits what I want to draw if I can't make it up. Blab. Are there any writers that have had a major influence on your writing style? Clowes. Some screenwriters, certainly very few comic book writers, a few novelists. The most recognizable influences would come from films, more from the directors than the writers. Russ Meyer never wrote any of his own dialogue, but it all had its own style, sort of an overblown pretentiousness that was completely aware of the fact that it was overblown and pretentious, but in such a slick, subtle way that it didn't matter. I like that. Almost a P.T. Barnum kind of thing. As a kid, I always made fun of TV shows like Dragnet. It's the easiest thing in the world to make fun of, but it also has a real appeal because it's so single-minded. After a while, you get to appreciate the directness of it and how everything is done for a certain effect. Absolutely every element in every shot is built up for a specific effect, and I think little things like that from film had more of an influence on me than comics. Now, more than ever, there are a lot of comics that I would sit down and enjoy reading and possibly be influenced by were I an impressionable lad once again. But 5 or 10 years ago, there were really no comics out there that I got a big kick out of. Blab. Did drugs or alcohol have an influence on your work? Clowes. I wouldn't say that. I have to be pretty much sober when I'm working. The real inspirations I've had all come out of a really lucid state where I'm very, very alert and very aware of my storytelling objectives. Blab. How do you achieve this lucid state? Clowes. Well, first I dress up in women's clothes and No, it's not something to be achieved. It's just something that happens. I've never been able to sit down and just write. I can write dialogue and things like that, but to come up with ideas, I know when I'm in a state of mind that's conducive to ideas. When I'm in that state, I drop everything and write as fast as I can. Blab. Of the artists currently involved in comics, whose work really turns you on? Clowes. This is going to sound really corrupt because most of them work for Fantagraphics. I happen to think that Fantagraphics hires the best people. Peter Bagg certainly impresses me with every issue of neat stuff. He gets funnier and funnier all the time and better in every way. And the Hernandez brothers get better with every issue of Love and Rockets. Those guys are remarkable to me, and they haven't shown any signs of burning out or slowing down. I like Friedman's work and some of Burns' stuff. I like his art. Blab. Do you like his stories? Clowes. Some of them are good. I like the thinking behind his stories. I'd hate to criticize any of those guys because they are doing work of merit. If you'd compare what's happening in comics nowadays to 10 years ago, we should be dropping down on our knees in thanks for every one of these goddamn things we get. Of course, I like Crumb, I like Weirdo, I like Kim Deitch's work. Who else? Blab. How about Chester Brown's Yummy Fur? Clowes. Yeah, but I think that perhaps it's in danger of being overrated right now. I think it's a really good comic, but now I hear that it's the greatest comic ever written, and I don't think it's that. But Chester Brown is very, very good, and I think he's going to get better and better. I like this guy, Jim Woodring, who does a comic called Jim. I think he's got 3 issues out. He's unbelievably talented. It's frightening how talented this guy is, and I imagine Jim is probably the worst selling comic in the world. I just hope its readership builds up because it's great. Another guy is Richard Sala. I think he does really good comics. And J.D. King. And I'm sure there are many others. Dennis Warden. One guy who deserves some credit is the nameless realistic artist who works on the Jack Chick tracks. Those little religious comics with titles like The Sissy and Big Daddy. There are 2 artists. One of them, the cartoon one, I think is Jack Chick. And the other guy is a real master of white trash realism. He reminds me of a fundamentalist George Evans. I'm not sure, but I think his name is Fred Carter. His drawings of the mutilated, crucified Christ are as good as your typical EC payoff, and The Broken Cross is one of the sickest comics I've ever read. Blab. Do you like Raw? Clowes. Not especially. I mean, Spiegelman's a very clever guy. I'm not sure if he planned it all this way, or whether he just lucked into it, but he found a good way to package comics. As a magazine, the Soho crowd is proud to have laying at the foot of their loft beds or whatever. It's an object that people like to own and show off, rather than a sleazy comic to hide behind the radiator. He's made Raw into a real big success, but I'm not sure whether it's a great magazine. It's certainly introduced us to some very good artists, Friedman and Burns specifically, and Munoz and Sampaio. Blab. Do you like Weirdo better? Clowes. Much better. In fact, despite all the counterculture cartoonist types I know, I can't think of anybody I've talked to in the last few years who really likes Raw, even people who've been printed in it. Blab. How about American Splendor? Clowes. I think it's a good idea for a comic. It doesn't always appeal to me for the most part because the art is kind of hacked out. Not to take away from these artists because I'm sure they are getting next to nothing to draw it. When you see the few pages Friedman draws for it, you think, now if Friedman drew the whole book, this would be something. But I know I wouldn't want to spend all my time drawing stories about someone else's life. If the art was at the same level as the writing, I think it would be something. If Friedman drew the entire thing, it would be an American institution. Blab. Were you a fan of the early underground comics? Clowes. Well, I didn't really think of them in terms of comics. I thought of them as pornography. I was in the 3rd grade when I first saw Zap, and I remember that a friend and I drew our own version of big-ass comics because we thought it was absolutely the funniest name in the world for a comic. But the early undergrounds seemed really alien to me, and I didn't relate to them at all. I still don't completely. I never related to the drug culture, and they seem to be too tied up in that. Blab. How do you go about coming up with ideas for stories? Clowes. Usually I start with just a title and sort of a vague image that I have for a story, and I'll try to work a story out of that, but most of the time, it doesn't pan out. And the times that it does work out, it almost writes itself. Blab. Are you well disciplined as an artist? Clowes. I'm getting better. I usually get up around noon or so, work 2 or 3 hours, and then I'll knock off for a while and pretty much waste the whole evening till 11 or so, and then I'll work from 11 until 5 or 6 in the morning. So it works out to 8 or 9 hours. That's my basic routine. Blab. Do you make a decent living working in the comics field? Clowes. No way. By most people's standards, it's really dismal. But the way my life is, compared to someone working in an office, I can't complain. I can choose my own hours. I can draw exactly what I want most of the time. I get fan letters. I'm not complaining about it at all. I'm not making the kind of money that a big commercial artist makes, or even the kind of money your average guy at McDonald's makes. But still, I wouldn't trade it for anything. If it got to the point where I needed a lot of money, like if I needed an operation on my dick or something, I would do commercial stuff. Ideally, one day this stuff is going to take off and people will start buying these comics. I'm not an overly optimistic person at all, but I really feel like it's going to happen eventually. Blab. When you say these comics, are you referring to comics in general? Clowes. No, I'm talking about comics that the general public can and will relate to, which doesn't really include comics about elves and junk like that. Maybe a certain segment of the population can relate to that. Nobody I know. But I really don't believe that the general population does at all. Blab. Why do you think most comics portray that type of subject matter? Clowes. Because I think comics can do that very well. I mean, on TV, costume superheroes look kind of silly. You know, a guy dressed up like that looks pretty stupid. In comics, it's somehow believable. Blab. Don't you think these costumed hero comics seem pretty stupid too? Clowes. Obviously. But they have their charm, I suppose, in the same way that a lot of stupid things do. The way regular comics are printed, especially nowadays, they're so crudely printed, they need these kind of overblown, colorful characters to make any sense out of them. And also, the whole mentality of collectors, which I think supports a lot of the comic industry right now, is one of a certain loyalty that doesn't make sense to me. I think there's a big difference between people who buy comics to read and collectors, who for the most part don't ever open the comics at all. They put them in plastic bags and then put them in an acid-free box in the back of their closet. I think Marvel makes a lot of its money off people like that. I think a lot of people feel, oh, I'll buy comics as an investment. They're going to go up in value. These are basically just small-time people who can't deal with any real way of investing money. But I think there is a segment of us who are separate from all of that, and I hope that eventually we'll be able to break away from the current system. Blab. Are you at all disillusioned with the medium of comics? Clowes. No, not with the medium. It's a neutral medium. Whatever you put into it, you get out of it. The whole caste system of the industry is really loathsome, but there's nothing you can do about it. Marvel and DC and all these other companies are putting out what the currently available audience wants to buy. We've got to try to reach a different audience with our stuff, because it's not for the same audience at all. How we do that is up to bigger minds than mine. Blab. Do you feel that developing new formats and different designs in which to package your work might help separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak? Clowes. It might. Personally, I like the format of comic books, though the way they are printed nowadays is pretty shoddy. I like the size. I like the disposable quality of comics. I'm not saying that I would dispose of comics, but I like the idea of just ripping them open and bending them around and reading them while you're eating a Whopper, dripping shit on them and not really caring. When you buy People magazine, you don't put on silk gloves so you don't get fingerprints on it like these guys do with their X-Men. You know, it's something to read, for Christ's sakes. However, I think to come up with a new name for comic books is just not going to help. Blab. They've always been comics. Why should that change now? Clowes. Yeah, it's silly because no one is going to be fooled by that. If you say, oh, I don't read comics, I read graphic novels, everyone is behind your backs muttering, he means comics, and thinking you're embarrassed by comics and just trying to cover it up with misleading terminology. Blab. Are you at all into that scratchy, lunatic cartoon style by people like Lynda Barry, Matt Groening, and Gary Panter? Clowes. I follow it to some extent. I'm not floored by any of it. I think Matt Groening is pretty funny. I think he's on the same level as the guy who does Calvin and Hobbes. I think he's become the darling of a certain crowd, and I'm not so sure either of those guys are all that great. I mean, I've heard Calvin and Hobbes being referred to as the new Peanuts. Maybe it's better than Peanuts is nowadays, but it's not even in the same ballpark as the early Peanut strips. With Groening, it seems like the novelty has worn off a bit. It's lost its edge. Sometimes I even skip over it when I'm looking at the reader. I think Lynda Barry's okay. Her drawing bothers me, but I think she's a pretty good writer. Blab. How about Panter's stuff? Clowes. I don't care for it. I think he's full of shit. There are little bits in it that I think are very amusing, but overall, I think he's pulling our collective leg. I really think that people who are into Gary Panter's comics are, for the most part, pseudo artists or artsy fartsy types who think they've developed some real artistic sensibilities and can appreciate something that the masses can't appreciate. I can see what he's doing, but it doesn't grab me. He's certainly inventive and has a look all his own, but when it comes to drawing comics, which is what I'm talking about, why do I have to read it? It seems intentionally oblique for no reason. It's going in a different direction than the stuff I'm interested in. Blab, do your parents follow your work? Clowes, they show some marginal enthusiasm every time one of my comics comes out, but I don't know if they're that thrilled about it. I think they're proud of me for what I do, but I'm not sure they really relate to it. Blab, do they have any qualms about some of your subject matter? Clowes, oh no, no qualms. My parents are very tolerant. As a kid, they encouraged me to be as independent as possible and not to worry about what other people think of what I do, and that includes them. Blab, have you ever read this statement by Zap artist Robert Williams, where he infers that a lot of you new cartoonists working in independent comics are ungrateful for the foundation that he and the other underground cartoonists laid? Clowes, yeah, I read that somewhere. I think it was in Escape magazine. Blab, how do you respond to a statement like that? Clowes, I can see how someone could be bitter about what happened to that whole scene. I mean, I think a lot of us, myself included, are in our own way envious of them. First off, they had a huge audience looking to them to bend their envelope of decency or whatever. These guys were challenging censorship, and it was a big issue. And maybe they were risking going to jail and stuff like that, but it was exciting. It was part of something that was getting a lot of attention back in the 60s. And all of those underground comics were selling thousands and thousands of copies because of that attention. And here we are in this generation, all of us fueled by our own dedication. We have our own motives, no giant throng of mass culture behind us. I think what we are doing is commendable in its own way. Blab, how do you assess your future as a cartoonist? Is there anything you'd rather do? Direct films, for example? Clowes, there's really nothing I'd rather do. I'd much rather draw comics than make films. There are too many compromises you have to make in the movie business. If the comic business folded completely, I'd still draw them for my own amusement. As to the future, who knows what will happen. Personally, I'd like to keep developing in every phase of the game. I don't think I've done anything near my best work yet. I hope to be able to maintain a fairly high energy level. Till I'm 30 anyway. You look at guys like Crumb and Kim Deitch, and they're still going strong after 20 years in the business. On the other hand, there are people like Jay-Z Lynch, who have no interest in drawing comics anymore. So I don't know. There's no telling how I'll wind up. Perhaps I'll go the way of Jack Cole and Wally Wood and blow my brains out.